Greetings to you all, and today we are going to explore Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest. Now, my guess is that some of you dismiss this. You think perhaps this play is frivolous nonsense, utterly irrelevant to us today, embedded in some colonial Victorian past that we're all desperately trying to hurtle away from. Okay, I get it. I'm going to argue differently. I'm going to argue that this play is very contemporary, in so much as it is a bomb, metaphorically speaking, a bomb planted in the stalls of the Victorian theatre in the London West End in 1895. Deliberately planted so as to explode in the faces of those members of the Victorian establishment who would subsequently imprison Oscar Wilde, ostensibly for his homosexuality, but I think more broadly because he was such a dangerous and transgressive and revolutionary writer. As I see it, he's Nietzschean in many ways. So what I'm going to do in this video is try and explore that, explain to you why I'm saying this, and of course demonstrate to you how part and parcel of what Wilde is doing here is taking us into a different treatment of memory. I think a good starting point would be to define a little better what we mean by modernism, because this play is a modernist work. In fact, you could even argue it's foreshadowing a postmodern theatre of the absurd. I'll come to that down the track. But what is modernism? I've given you a kind of definition of romanticism and symbolism. We shift into the 20th century. What is modernism? And it's a difficult question to answer in a sense because it kind of depends which classroom you're sitting in. If you are in an engineering class, a design class, technology class, science class, then I think modernism is going to come across as a celebration of our capacity to use reason so as to solve problems, to make life more convenient, more productive. It's a celebration of the transformative powers of reason in that sense, an affirmation of how we can use our knowledge to make our lives better and our world better. And you know, we can then just go to whatever sector and start to explore modernism in that sense. If we were looking at architecture, we might analyze the work of Le Corbusier, who died, I think, in 1965, and who saw design in terms of rejection of opulence and rejection of the ornate towards much clearer lines and geometric shapes, towards functionality and practicality, and driving his approach to design and architecture was also a notion of, I suppose, social equality. Yeah, you can explore that in your own time as you wish. My point is that if we turn to the humanities, the social sciences, shall we say, we have a different understanding of modernism. Much more of a reaction against Enlightenment principles. So let's just remind ourselves of what I mean by that. The Enlightenment is that period we can take from sort of 1620-ish right up to the end of or maybe the beginning of the French Revolution, 1789. I mean, historians and academics argue about these dates. That is essentially the age of enlightenment, the age of reason, and for all their differences, philosophers in this period and thinkers and writers shared, I think, three basic core principles or ideas. The first is that there is an answer to every reasonable question. The second is that we will find that answer if we exercise reason. We may not be ready to find the answer yet. We may not have enough knowledge, but we will get there one day. And the third premise of this all is that every answer we do arrive at is consistent with ones that we've already found. I mean, these basic Enlightenment principles drive, even today, the work that we do in science, engineering, technology, whatever. I mean, you have to kind of understand and accept those principles. But not in the humanities and the social sciences. And in many ways, as we've seen, Romanticism is already starting to fight back against how these principles are applied in society, for example, in the forms and modes of the Industrial Revolution. And by the time we get to the early 20th century and a bit beyond, there is a consistent and louder reaction against the rule of reason. The idea that, you know, there are ideologies, religions, nationalisms, principles that we can just rely on as certain and drive our lives accordingly. This becomes increasingly untenable. You know, Freud is picking away at this, saying, well, you know, reason's all very well, but there are, of course, many more ways in which we need to explore human behavior. Two key events really bring this reaction to a crisis. The first is the First World War that took place between 1914 and 1918. Something like 17 million people died in that war, and there was something like 20 million casualties. And by the end of it, nobody really had an idea of why it had happened. It may have been launched with flag flying, but that pretty quickly dwindled. And even a year later, 1915-16, people were just clueless about why this was happening. Today, there is a fabulous academic argument about the origins of the First World War, whether it be A.J.B. Taylor or Clark or whatever. So, on top of that, there followed the Spanish flu, which didn't really resolve itself until sort of 1921. And the estimates there vary considerably, but we're looking at something between 20 and 50 million people dying from the Spanish flu influenza, and multiple more in terms of casualties. So this was an experience of a pandemic quite beyond what we've actually just gone through. And you can imagine someone in 1921, 1922 who's actually survived all this, thinking to themselves, bloody hell, you know, what can I rely on anymore? All these old ideas are corrupted and useless, whether it be glory or honor or patriotism, religion, just, you know. There's an image that I use in the class to sort of demonstrate this. This is the Crystal Palace that was built in 1851 as the first expo, actually, in London. And it, you know, you can see the dimension of it, the scale of it, how impressive it is. It represents symbolically, if you like, the zenith, the height of the British Empire. And in it, there would be all these pavilions from different parts of the world where people would be demonstrating the latest inventions and crafts and designs and ideas. You know, if you want a physical symbol of the Enlightenment, there it is. It's still alive and thriving there in Crystal Palace in 1851, whipped up, of course, and hoisted on this notion of British imperialism. There's another picture here. And then we have that. So this was in 1936. Actually, my dad's first memory. As he recalls it, he was held up to the window by his father to look at this fire on the hill, and it was the burning down of the Crystal Palace. And it seems as though it was just an accident. Some workman left his blowtorch on, whatever. Excuse me. But I think that actually sort of captures, in a very visual way, what's just happened in the last, 30, 40 years or so. And there's another thing I like to show students, which sort of illustrates this shift. This is an astonishing painting by Velázquez of Pope Innocent X, and it was painted in 1650. And, well, there you have an Enlightenment figure, don't you, I suppose, a figure who belongs in that regime, in that time period. And this is what Francis Bacon did to him Bacon died in 1992. I'm not quite sure when this was painted, but it's a really dramatic collapse, isn't it? Some might say horrific or not, I don't know, but I think it captures very well this two different worlds that we're talking about here. So, if modernism, after these two cataclysmic events, is a literary, intellectual, and artistic movement which is seeking new forms, seeking to, in a sense, obliterate the old. We find this in different avenues, don't we? In music, we find it in Stravinsky, in The Rite of Spring, which came out in 1913. We also find it in the atonal scale of Schoenberg. We find it in the surrealist art. We're actually going to look at some surrealist photographs in the next part of the course. In the novel, we find it in the movement away from syntagmatic text and narration towards paradigmatic text. And we've read with Joyce a very good example of that, I think. And with regards to memory in literature, we move towards much more episodic and autobiographical memory, as we've seen with Joyce. We move towards an understanding of memory importing cultural and communal memories. But we also, with Wilde here, enter perhaps a new consideration of memory, because in a world in which the factual sort of matrix itself has become uncertain, where there are no certainties, and where all the ideologies and things that have been driving society have sort of crumbled. Absent any reliable factual matrix, then how do we consider subjectivity itself? What it is to be a human being becomes, if you like, susceptible to these same uncertainties. And that takes us to the importance of being earnest, because the play turns on the uncertainties of identity, the identity of Jack, the identity of Ernest. And in fact, the resolution of that problem is only to be found by tunneling back in the memory of an idiot, which is Lady Bracknell, right? So, let's focus now on the importance of being earnest. One of the things we should notice about it is the way in which it uses memory in its use of generic conventions. Now, genre is a collective or communal memory of rules and conventions that go to the creation of something that we all can now expect. In his first book of Poetics, Aristotle, who I think died 352 BC, gives us the things we should expect in a tragedy. Okay, so we have a person of noble birth who makes a mistake, that's called hamartia, and then they refuse to accept that they've made a mistake out of pride, which is called hubris. and then shit happens. They're powerless to do anything about it. And then they realize towards the end that it was all their own fault. And in the audience, we experience what Aristotle calls catharsis. We learn from this experience, but we also kind of enjoy it because of the distance we have from what's going on. In other words, we're not the ones suffering, right? In his second book of Poetics, Aristotle gives us a generic definition of comedy, of what we should expect in a comedy. Now, unfortunately, we've lost the book. But if we go back to the ancient Greek comedies of the 4th, 5th century BC, Euripides and others, Sophocles, and then move towards the Roman comedies of Plautus and Terence, we find consistently the same things happening, the same elements. And many of them take us right up to the present, to The Simpsons, to Family Guy, to whatever comedy you're going to watch tonight on Netflix. They're using in so many ways the same basic comedic conventions. This is, in a sense, a generic memory that we have. And we can't analyze this play. We can't begin to analyze it without tapping into this sort of collective database and memory of what comedy is. Beginning with perhaps the joke. So let's just think about a joke. Even better, why don't I tell you a joke? Try to, at least. So, trying to think of one. There's a nun, a lawyer, and a priest. And they are on a sinking ship. So just think Titanic, all right? It's a total effing disaster. The thing is like tilted and it's the middle of the night and the waves crashing all over it and you know, lights flickering, people screaming, the band is kind of playing, the deck chairs are sliding off. And these three characters are clinging on to the handrails. And the nun screams out, the children, we have to help the children. And the lawyer says, fuck the children. And the priest says, oh, do you think there's still time? Bad, yeah? Funny, I hope. Now, before some of you run off to complain to the dean about, you know, how offensive the joke was, let's at least analyze it. Because it contains everything that we ought to expect in a joke. And its targeting is clever. And using a point of reference that you may not have picked up on. So, what have we got here? Basic elements of the joke. We have performance, such as it was. But anyway, we've all told jokes and forgotten the punchline, right? So you got to somehow perform it. Then you have the tripartite structure. That's fascinating. That seems to work in our brains in a profound way in so many different sectors. Music, for example, especially in classical music, you have a phrase, you have a repetition of the phrase, and the modulation is the third time. So that tripartite structure tends to be very important in the telling of a joke. You have a surprise and a reversal, usually creating shock. You have exaggeration or hyperbole. And very often, particularly if it's satirical, you're going to have a target. Now, in this particular joke, the target is these two guys who are representatives of communal morality and authority, aren't they? You have a lawyer and you have a priest. Well, look what happens to them in the joke. But the only reason the joke works is because it assumes we all share a collective morality, and that is voiced by the nun. We should care for the children. So the joke is actually embedded in that moral principle. Now, the importance of being earnest, as I'm sure you realized, is really just a running joke. Joke after joke after joke. It's an extended joke. The form of joke in this play is that of the epigram or the paradox. So that is a type of joke which, on its surface, creates an absurdity, an amusing absurdity. But in its kernel inside it is saying something, or trying to say something quite profound. There was a saying in Victorian England that drink is the plague of the working classes. In other words, they just drink too much, and then they can't work properly, and then they're not efficient. What a terrible thing. And so you had temperance movements and politicians who were trying to deal with this problem. And Oscar Wilde typically just reversed it and talked about how work was the plague of the drinking classes. Now, this is a paradox. I mean, it's funny, it's absurd, but it's actually bitingly satirical, because what he's aiming at here is that elite Victorian aristocratic society that depended upon the working classes to run Britain while they were at home drinking, right? So, that was the punch. This play, to be more precise, is a succession of paradoxes or epigrams written with this intent. Let's, as an example, go to page 44, which I think is just after the beginning of Act 3. So we have Gwendolen saying, true, she says, in matters of grave importance, style, not sincerity, is the vital thing. And you think, well, you laugh, and then you think, well, bloody hell, I mean, that's just ridiculous, that's crazy. But this is actually a paradox which in many ways reveals the whole play. At one level, it satirizes the superficiality of the Victorian upper classes. But it also suggests that in a world absent any certainties, it's actually foolish to be sincere about anything. And in that sense, the only thing that really does matter is being clever in the way that you say things, or shall we say style, which is essentially what Gwendolen is saying here. So more generally, what I think Wilde is doing with these paradoxes, with this chain of epigrams, as we can call them, is challenging the conventional notions of seriousness that were driving Victorian society. And what's another word for serious? Earnest. That's what the word means, earnest. You could say that Wilde is attacking the importance Victorians attached to being important. He is challenging those very categories of important that were driving Victorian society. He's not going to go along with them. He thinks they're absurd. There's another example. Let's give that to you on page 10. Here we have Gwendolen at the bottom here, saying, she says, that is clearly a metaphysical speculation. And like most metaphysical speculations, has very little reference at all to the actual facts of real life as we know them. And then a bit further up the page, she says to Jack, even before I met you, I was far from indifferent to you. And Jack looks at her in amazement. And she says, well, we live, as I hope you know, Mr. Worthing, in an age of ideals. The fact is constantly mentioned in the most expensive monthly magazines and has reached the provincial pulpits, I'm told. And my ideal has always been to love someone of the name of Ernest. There is something in that name that inspires absolute confidence. The moment Algernon first mentioned to me that he'd had a friend called Ernest, I knew I was destined to love you. And then 33, Cecily says the same thing. Here she is. You must not laugh at me, darling, but it had always been a girlish dream of mine to have someone whose name was Ernest. There is something in that name that seems to inspire absolute confidence. There's no accident here that Wilde is using exactly the same phrase in The Two Women. This is the gameplay, and we'll see that adverted to in the next play we study, Travesties, here. I mean, the joke is on Gwendolen in that first example, because the actual fact that she's relying on is false, as we know, all right? I mean, that Jack is not earnest. But at the end of the play, her faith in that ideal is sort of vindicated because Jack is revealed to actually be earnest. But it's vindicated in a way that's absurd. And that's Wilde's point. There is no vindication that works. There is no validation stamp that can be relied upon here. Because after all, Jack's identity is ultimately revealed in the memory of an idiot, which is Lady Bracknell. Right? Nothing can be relied upon here. Wilde is showing us that in many ways, facts are creations. Or as William James would say, that which is good in the way of belief. And that's why I say Wilde is Nietzschean. Nietzsche wrote an essay called Truth and Lying in the Non-Moral Sense, in which he says truth is a mobile army of metaphors. That's really all we have. And I think this is helpful in understanding how incendiary this play really is, even though it's written in 1895, before the First World War and the Spanish influenza. Wilde is already taking us into this this place of epistemological crisis, really. Another convention of the genre, the comedy genre, if I can call it that. Another key element is dramatic irony. And dramatic irony is that moment in a theatre or in a film, TV, comedy show when we know something that that character doesn't. And their ignorance sort of drives the comedy because they're manipulated or deceived or whatever. And you know, this thrills us because we have like the inside track on what's happening. Although, of course, dramatic irony can happen to us and be done to us, so that we've been assuming something all the way along, and then we're told something else. And this, of course, is central to the importance of being earnest. If we break down dramatic irony, we can find that there is usually a scheme, a plan, which kind of triggers the whole comedy half-hour show, whatever it is we're watching. It's Baldrick's cunning plan, if you ever watched Blackadder, right? And the scheme in this play is bun-burying. It's Algy pretending to have, you know, the fictitious Ernest. It's the creation of Jack's bad brother, Ernest. It's, you know, these are the schemes. We then have another important element, which is disguise. So we have the mourning dress that Jack wears for this fictional funeral. We have mistaken identities. I mean, the whole play sort of runs on mistaken identity, doesn't it? So that's another key element of dramatic irony. Excuse me. And we also have stock characters. I thought I'd take you to the Commedia dell'arte on this. This is sort of 16th to 18th century Italian troubadours wearing conventional stereotypical masks and playing stereotypical characters as they kind of traveled around villages and towns and cities. Lampooning and satirizing society, and nobody was exempt. Here we have a sort of breakdown of the different characters that we might encounter. Brighella, the kind of scheming liar, Pantalone, greedy, wealthy, miserly. There would be a dottore, sometimes there would be a swaggering soldier, pompous. Harlequin, mischievous comic, sprightly, often a servant. The innamorati are the lovers who just can't quite connect. Piero, Colombina, La Signora. This is another representation of it. And we have the two elements here that were missing from the previous one. So we have the Magnifico, the kind of monarch or ruling elite figure who would be lampooned or made fun of. And we have the Zani, the slaves. Just think of Fawlty Towers, right? Or just think of anything like that, slave bashing. These characters sort of inform, or can be found, I should first say, in ancient Greek and Roman comedy, and they inform much of modern comedy today. You could perform the importance of being earnest as a commedia dell'arte. I mean, you really could. You could have Lady Bracknell as the Magnifico, right? And you could have Algernon and Jack as the kind of Harlequin figures. Yeah, you could run it like that. I don't think very successfully, but you can hopefully see that we do have some elements of stock character here, particularly if we think about the notion of the rake. Now, the rake is more of an invention of the English Restoration comedy, so late 17th century. And the rake is that roguish fellow who tends to be good looking, clever, devious, manipulative, very much a figure of independence and maverick, rejecting the rules, pushing the envelope, breaking laws, but not in a bad way, mischievous rather than bad. And that's how I think we might better see Jack and Algernon, this kind of rakish, roguish figures in that sense. And these rogues, are to be found often in modernist comedy of manners and in farces. And I assume you kind of know, you're kind of familiar with the Feydeau farce, with the doors slamming and people running in and out of each other's bedrooms and stuff like this going on. So there is a sense in which this play is farcical and nonsensical in that generic sense. Farce is, in some respects, I think, a bridge, a pivot point between comedy of manners and the comedy of the absurd. And I think that's how I see this play in many ways, as a pivot point between these two things. It's so easy when you first read this play or see it to just say, oh, it's a comedy of manners and it belongs in the Victorian world. But it's so much more than that. It's actually pushing boundaries. So yes, as a comedy of manners, the play memorizes or rehearses basic conventional tropes of comedy, which is what I've just been talking about for the last 20 minutes. All these categories of joke, the categories of dramatic irony, stock characters, we can find all of that being rehearsed before us in The Importance of Being Earnest. But the play also takes us into a darker realm. The plot is absurd. And just to underline that, the word absurd is used expressly in pages 28, well, why don't I just give you the bloody pages? So 28, 30, 44, Wilde is deliberately using the word absurd as if to kind of make this point. But what's interesting is that all the characters on the stage behave and act as if it's completely rational, the world around them. There's a sort of systemic compliance among the characters on the stage with what is going on, which in the audience we interpret as absurd. And that's why it's not quite absurd theatre. Absurd theatre is when the characters turn to the audience and say, "What is going on?" Right? You would have Pirandello's 6 characters in search of an author, and the absurdist plays that take us into the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Samuel Beckett and so on. So I don't think Wilde is there, but I think he's taking us there. And in that sense, the play is moving us in that direction. The representatives of core Victorian values in this play are utterly ridiculed and lampooned. I mean, who are they? It's the priest, Chasuble, and the governess, Miss Prism. If you go to 27, so 3 or 4 pages from the beginning of Act 2, here's Chasuble saying, "My sermon on the meaning of the manna in the wilderness can be adapted to almost any occasion, joyful or, as in the present case, distressing. I've preached it at harvest celebrations, christenings, non-confirmations, of days of humiliation and festal days." 22, we have this exchange with Cecily and Miss Prism. And Prism says, do not speak slightingly of the 3-volume novel, Cecily. I wrote one myself in earlier days. Did you really, Miss Prism? How wonderfully clever you are. I hope it did not end happily. I don't like novels that end happily. They depress me so much. The good ended happily, and the bad unhappily. That is what fiction means. She's an idiot, right? She's an idiot. And Boyle is just having fun with that. The maker of the law in this play is created by the Magnifico Lady Bracknell. Lady Bracknell, who is herself an idiot. Was on page 15. Yeah, here she is. She says, I should strongly advise you, Mr. Worthing, to try and acquire some relatives as soon as possible, and to make a definite effort to produce at any rate one parent of either sex before the season is quite over. Ridiculous, right? She makes the law, though, and everybody kind of goes along with it. And, we are to recognize that fact. If order is disorder, because that's what Wilde is telling us, if it's all just complete bloody nonsense, then what do we do? What do we do? How are we to behave? And as I was saying earlier, if there is no factual matrix that can be relied upon here, if everything is just metaphoric and uncertain, as Nietzsche would say, then why would we think for one moment that human identity itself be exempt from that uncertainty? Isn't subject identity itself, what it is to be a human being, subject to exactly the same question and problem? Right at the end here, Jack says, Lady Bracknell, I hate to seem inquisitive, but would you kindly inform me who I am? That's the question. Who am I? And the confirmation of identity here is validation by an idiot. It's absurd, which is back to the paradox I was telling you about earlier. It's the same paradox, it's the same joke. You have a validation of something, but it's validated absurdly, so there's no validation. That's the issue here. But let's understand the difference between what Joyce is doing and what Wilde is doing. Joyce, writing his novel, The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, in, I think, 1904, 1905, is still, I think, drawing on an idea that, that there is a memory that can be used and trusted and relied upon once it's tunneled and recreated through associations episodically, so as to help one understand oneself, one's identity. And when you've done that, you're going to have a better idea of what you should do with your life. I mean, we talked about this in the last video, right? So I think that's how memory is operating for Virginia Woolf, how it's operating for Joyce and other modernist writers. Wilde is taking us somewhere altogether different and foreshadowing, I think, more than Joyce, far more than Joyce, the darkness of the post-First World War and Spanish flu world. What Wilde is saying is you can't rely on memory. There's nothing reliable about anything, so why should we think that our memories are reliable? They're not. That's the shocking, if you like, step that Wilde is taking. Each act, we should notice, ends in utter nonsense, and the word nonsense is used. I'll give you the page numbers. Page 19, page 42, page 54. And it appears that Wilde is using comedy here. He's using it not just to show how Victorian values and mores and realities and conventions are groundless, absurd, meaningless, but to show us that reality itself is a hollow concept. It's something that we have to fashion ourselves. And in answer to the question, well then, how do we live our lives? Wilde's answer, I think, was quite clear and became clearer in his other works, in particular Dorian Gray, The Picture of Dorian Gray. Wilde's answer was, well, all we can do is live our lives in pursuit of new sensations, feeding our appetites, our desires, our lusts in pursuit of beauty. This is aestheticism. This is new hedonism. Some would say immoral. Certainly the Victorians in his day considered it to be immoral and dangerous. Others might say amoral. And yeah, we can see the precursor of this in Edgar Allan Poe, although Poe, I think, did have a notion of a broader outside ethical compass. But by the time we get to Oscar Wilde, no, I mean, I don't think there is that. And that's what made him so threatening and so dangerous. Now, part of the effect of this, if we focus again on memory, the subject matter of this course, is that absent any certainty, shall we say, then time itself becomes much more problematic for us to conjure with. This chronological sort of matrix that we have, past, present, and future, that we live our lives by so conveniently, is itself shrouded in uncertainty and itself problematic. And that is very much a modernist theme, isn't it? I mentioned Faulkner before to you. The past is not dead, the past is not even past. And so, we talked about time slips, so we've already talked about how that sort of convenient matrix is crumbling and difficult, and stream of conscious is about that too, isn't it? It takes us to that point. But what this means for Wilde is nothing anymore can be said to be encoded in the past. There is no pure involuntary memory as Proust would have it. Rather, everything is in a sense up for grabs, or to put it more precisely, when we remember something, we are confabulating. We are going to be subjecting what it is we draw from our past to the metaphors and fictions that we resort to when we fashion anything, any reality, any truth, any memory. That's where Wilde takes us. He's taking us to travesties, which is the next play that we're going to look at. And in case you haven't looked at it yet, Travesties is an actual rewriting of The Importance of Being Earnest. That's what Tom Stoppard is doing. And he's exploring and teasing out these problems even more for us. And we'll see that confabulation becomes central to the play and to what's happening to the literary treatment of memory as we move through the 20th century. Okay, that's it for now, and I will see you in the next video.